Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Every year at the G20 summit, a group of leaders who represent some of the world's largest economies get together to hammer out deals that will shape how money flows around the world. And Bloomberg executive editor Flavia Krause-Jackson says there's one tradition that looms large.
There are few things that are more iconic and memorable and important from an optics point of view than the family photo.
That so-called family photo happens every G20. All the leaders at the conference line up, often in front of their flags or a scenic backdrop, for a formal portrait. This time around, leaders like UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Chinese President Xi Jinping, Argentinian President Javier Milei, and this year's G20 host, Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. It's a picture that's shared around the world and scrutinized for clues.
That is when you really get a sense of how these men and women really get on. It can tell you a lot about the shifting balance of power. So people pay a lot of attention to, well, who's in the center? Who's got their arms around someone else?
But when the family photo was taken at this year's G20 summit, which wrapped up yesterday in Rio de Janeiro, it took the world by surprise. Because some important people were missing.
The fact that Joe Biden was not to be seen in that photo and that photo was taken speaks volumes really about some of the concerns that people have about the status of the U.S. and where it's headed.
G20 organizers said President Biden and other leaders, like Italy's Giorgia Meloni and Canada's Justin Trudeau, were missing from the photo because they were late. Biden's camp blamed logistical issues and said the photo was taken too early. And while they did ultimately take a second photo, with Biden in the center, Flavia says,
I don't think you're going to get any more lasting symbolism about the vanishing sort of influence of America than the fact that you have a G20 picture without the president of the biggest, most powerful nation in it.
As the summit grappled with breaking news out of Ukraine on Tuesday, the country launched its first U.S.-made long-range missiles into Russia, leaders faced another reality. As Biden wraps up his final months in office, as global conflicts escalate, and as the world prepares for the second term of President-elect Donald Trump, the world order is shifting. I'm Sarah Holder, and this is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. Today on the show, my co-host David Gura takes us to Rio de Janeiro, where he and Flavia break down the biggest takeaways from this year's G20 summit.
Flavia, it's great to speak with you from our perch here above Copacabana Beach. And I want to start with Ukraine. There was a formal agenda for this summit that was kind of scuttled by developments halfway around the world. Just get us up to speed on what happened on that battleground.
I mean, yes, as the G20 leaders were getting ready to start their second day here in Rio de Janeiro, the news hit them that things had suddenly escalated. We had broken the news, along with the New York Times and Washington Post, that the U.S. had finally decided to come to Ukraine's rescue and send them some long-range missiles. And on the 1,000th day since the start of the conflict, i.e. when Vladimir Putin decided to invade his neighbor, Zelensky, who was not invited here in Rio and was not very happy about it, decided to take advantage of its newly granted missile capabilities to strike a military base inside Russian territory. And Moscow sort of essentially responded in kind on the same day, upped its threat of a nuclear response to conventional attacks. So this was essentially what leaders here at the G20 woke up to. And it's no coincidence, really, that Ukraine and the war also in the Middle East have essentially dominated the agenda and really exposed the extent to which the world's biggest powers and economies just can't seem to agree on anything.
I want to ask you about the reaction to what's happened among members of the G20. And we should say this is a group of nations, not all of whom are allied with one another. There are disagreements among these members of the group of 20. How did they respond? How did this kind of color the conversations they were having with each other on the sidelines of this event?
I would say that flat out, the biggest thing that they were talking about privately is how the hell they're going to handle Donald Trump when he comes back in 2025. And, the takeaway is the following. Flattery will only get you so far. Don't show weakness. Never grovel. and always ask the difficult questions. And you're going to see people like Emmanuel Macron, who have like that personal chemistry with Donald Trump, who are really going to try and play up on it.
I want to ask you where all of this might be headed, and I think in particular about the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who is here on the heels of having a phone conversation with Russia's President Vladimir Putin. I think, suffice to say, a lot of leaders here wanted to hear about how that phone call went. Did we learn anything from him, from those who spoke with him, about what was discussed and sort of what a negotiated settlement might look like if Ukraine and its allies were to go down that path?
I can tell you what we learned, that a lot of leaders were not happy with him having that phone call at all. They didn't feel like he consulted with them particularly. They felt that he didn't get much out of it. And it felt a little bit like he was trying to sort of, almost ingratiate himself with Trump. I mean, what the interesting thing that happened, obviously, is that after the leak on the US missiles, there was sort of an expectation that perhaps some of the other countries would act in kind. And Scholz immediately came out and said that Germany wasn't going to volunteer any Tauruses. And so people immediately were like, hold on a second, you're a massive lame duck. He's being forced into early elections. He might even be heading back into a palace coup. Things are looking very grim for him domestically. He had this call that really a lot of his colleagues didn't appreciate. And also, he blatantly backed the wrong horse, and he was kept waiting by Trump for ages before he could even get a phone call with him. Stepping
back a little further, here we are on what is the 1,000th day of the war in Ukraine. Do we have a sense of sort of where this is headed? Bloomberg News had reported in the run-up to this summit there is more agreement among allies that perhaps this ends at the negotiating table. What's your best sense of sort of where we go from here as this summit dissolves?
I think it would be a fool's errand to try and predict how this will end. I mean, of course, Trump has come in and said he would click his fingers and end it in a day. But I think there is a growing sense that we're headed towards some kind of frozen conflict. The appearance of 10,000 North Korean soldiers by the border certainly was a wake-up call. We reported over the weekend that there might go up to as much as 100,000, and that's certainly a game changer. You have countries like China, Xi Jinping, who's not particularly happy about that development and sort of wondering, okay, where is this headed? But again, Zelensky wants to end this. Putin doesn't respect anyone when he thinks they're coming into a position of weakness. So also one should interpret some of the actions by Biden, who's in his last 2 months in power, as someone who's essentially trying to do whatever he can to prop Zelensky up, to try and give him a little bit of an edge, a bit more of a head start before he kind of sits at the table and negotiates. But I think, ultimately you're looking at the fact that he's going to have to give up some territory, and no one really wants to say the quiet part out loud.
More from Flavia and David's conversation after the break. We're back. My co-host David Gura spoke with Bloomberg's Flavia Krause-Jackson on the ground in Rio de Janeiro about the shifting world order at this year's G20 summit. Here's more from their conversation.
So in years past, you've kind of watched the American president at events like these, and he plays a central role. How different was Joe Biden's stature at the summit here in Rio?
It was interesting to sort of observe Biden in this setting because it's clear that, people will miss him. They will sort of remember Joe Biden perhaps fondly. Yesterday during cocktail hour, everyone wanted to have a selfie with him, and he was being a good sport. And there's this sort of general idea that, he represents a set of values about what the U.S. is, what it represents in terms of the force of good, its duties towards other nations and preserving peace, that will simply be lost in the next 4 years under a very, very different president who represents incredibly different values, whose approach to geopolitics, as has been said repeatedly, is incredibly transactional. Probably his biggest meeting was with President Xi, and of course, if things had gone differently, if Kamala Harris had won, he would have shown up at APEC with her, and that would have been an incredibly important meeting. And I think it would be interesting to sort of think about what the two of them had to say to each other. That sort of meeting took on a different, more understated meaning given current events, and one can only imagine that perhaps Biden tried to sort of impart some of his wisdom gleaned over the past few years. I think what people will remember is that 4 years ago, Joe Biden declared America's back. And the image that people will recall is him quite literally fading into the jungle as he landed in the Amazon in Manaus.
As you watched all of this unfold, as he kind of faded into the background here in Rio, who was in the foreground? Who was stepping forward? Who was kind of taking up the mantle that he once had?
Javier Milei was rocking it. He absolutely reveled in really kind of almost taunting Lula. They are complete opposites ideologically, and you could tell that he was really enjoying kind of needling Lula. There was a picture of them when they kind of stood side by side and they were stony-faced. But, you know, he is incredibly charismatic. He rocked up with his girlfriend and his sister, who is his biggest confidant and is in every meeting. He and Macron were like kind of grasping at each other and kind of striking manly poses. He was going off on rants about the free market. He was flushed with the enjoyment of having just come here from having been in Mar-a-Lago, where, you know, he was hanging out with Elon Musk and Trump. So I think for many, you know, he was a gravitational pull of like, okay, this is a guy who has access. And I think that's very much what you saw here at the G20. Everyone was kind of looking out for themselves and trying to work out, okay, how can I ingratiate myself with the new power brokers in this group?
Flav, talk about that other pole, that other center of gravity kind of drawing these leaders toward it. That is Mar-a-Lago, that is South Florida, where Donald Trump, the president-elect, is waiting for his inauguration. You mentioned that Javier Milei of Argentina went there. Were other leaders thinking about making a trip there? Did other leaders make a trip there in advance of or after this summit?
Everyone who's anyone is trying to get there, and if they're telling you they're not, they're lying. Giorgia Meloni is kind of put out the feelers. Her in is Elon Musk. He absolutely adores her. He has a sort of strange fixation with birth rates. Italy has one of the lowest, so he's been to Rome several times. Macron has a good relationship with Trump and is probably trying to leverage that as well. Starmer, God bless him, is in really bad shape. He managed to put his foot in it with Xi by chiding China on human rights and Taiwan, and he doesn't have many inroads with Trump. But, you know, a lot of people have already had conversations with Trump, and one quite interesting development there is how many times Elon Musk has popped up in those conversations. So, for example, with Serbia's Vučić or even Erdogan, Turkey's president and leader, he was here today. He has a good relationship with Trump. So it's very interesting to see, you know, just these sort of unusual ways in which people are trying to get to him. And, of course, everyone's trying to brush up on their golf skills.
Going into the summit, I talked to Ben Rhodes, who was a foreign policy advisor to President Obama, and he told me it was a distraction to look at how the participants in this summit would be thinking about a Trump presidency. What would be more interesting, as he put it, is to look at what new relationships are forming, what kind of new trade alliances we're seeing formed on the sidelines of this, the G20 summit. Did you see anything that stood out to you about the way that sand is shifting, the way the terrain is shifting?
I think what really stood out for me, and you could see it in the family picture when she was in the middle holding hands and putting them up, is that the global South felt pretty unified. That, you know, Modi and Xi and Ramaphosa and these other countries, there was a clarity to what they were bringing to the table, how they saw things. The shambles was on the other side of the table. And so the idea that actually in a world where Trump is back, where things are delineated and very clear, you're either on the good side or the bad side. You either run a trade deficit or a trade surplus, that the rules of engagement were quite clear, and it wasn't masked by some of the other stuff, which is, you know, democratic values and human rights and all of that. That it really boiled down to the sheer economics of it. And of course, that's where the rubber meets the road, because if Trump does come in and slap China with 60% tariffs and everyone starts escalating, then that is going to be a very interesting scenario and a very complicated scenario for a lot of the powers that will be meeting next year.
That was David Gura with Bloomberg's Flavia Krause-Jackson in Rio de Janeiro. And this is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm Sarah Holder. This episode was produced by David Fox. It was edited by Aaron Edwards and Greg White, fact-checked by Adriana Tapia, and mixed by Alex Sugiura. Our senior producer is Naomi Shavin. Our senior editor is Elizabeth Ponso. Our executive producer is Nicole Beamster-Bohr. Sage Bauman is Bloomberg's head of podcasts. If you like this episode, make sure to subscribe and review The Big Take wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps people find the show. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.